Our first witness is Bella Sankey, who's director of the charity Detention Action, which works for the rights and welfare of immigrants. Bella Sankey, let's start with the most basic charity begins at home question. Do you see any clash of interests in throwing open the doors to thousands of refugees when we already have a housing crisis and 1 million on council house waiting lists?
I don't see a conflict, Michael, and I think the first thing to say is that the whole premise of refugee protection is our common humanity, and the fact that refugees are in a crisis, in an emergency situation. It's the equivalent to somebody knocking on your door who's escaping a domestic abuser or a neighbour whose house is on fire. You don't stop and ask whether you've got the finance or the time to help them. You respond in a really immediate and an instinctive way. And that's what refugee protection is about. But even if you want to look at it through the macroeconomic lens, this is pitting groups of people against each other in a completely unnecessary way. It's long been the case in successive economic studies that migrants make a net contribution to our society. They're not a drain on our GDP, but a net contributor to it.
Do you see any limit, numerical or otherwise?
I think when it comes to refugee protection, international cooperation is key, and it's through international cooperation that you ensure that every country, or the countries that are willing to, do their bit, and no country has a number of refugees that will overwhelm their society. But the fundamental premise of the Refugee Convention is that when people arrive at a border and they claim asylum, it's not about counting numbers. It's about assessing somebody's genuine need. And making decisions on that basis, on a case-by-case basis.
It feels to that country like immigration, doesn't it? And wouldn't it be sort of rather better to acknowledge that not everyone feels the same generosity that you deem to be required on that score?
Well, I think if you look at the recent public polling, actually there's a really significant majority of support for refugee protection. I think for the last few years, this government has sort of banged the drum and I would say demonised refugees. And you've seen that in the way that the small boat crossings have been covered and the government's response to that. But whenever you get back to what the British public are calling for and want to see, you always see such overwhelming support, not just now, but in 2015 and 2016, when you saw large numbers of refugees coming to Europe and coming to the UK. The polling consistently showed then that people wanted the government to do more, and they wanted the government to be more generous.
Tim Stanley?
Why do you think there has been a different response to Ukraine versus people coming across the Channel on boats?
Well, as I say, I think the key difference is the way that the government has responded.
Right.
I think there is consistency.
So why do you think the government has responded differently from Ukraine to the Calais situation?
I think that the government has actually got a pretty toxic agenda in this area, if I'm honest.
It's a very popular government. It was elected with a large majority.
Well, you've seen actually quite a lot of Conservative MPs criticising the government on its refugee policy. If you go back to the Conservative manifesto in 2019, they pledged to uphold the Refugee Convention. You've now got the UN saying that Priti Patel's flagship bill is taking the UK away from the Refugee Convention. So I don't think there is a public mandate.
Isn't there a difference? Isn't there a practical material difference between what's happening over the Channel versus Ukraine, which is that what's happening across the Channel is dangerous and illegal, whereas in the case of Ukraine, it's not dangerous and these people are being invited?
What's happening in the Channel is dangerous because the people that are seeking to come to the UK and seek sanctuary here have not been provided with a safe route. That's the key difference between this and the Ukrainian situation.
So this bill aims to stop something dangerous from happening?
No, because this bill aims to criminalise those people, which will inevitably mean that highly vulnerable and very traumatised people will be basically punished for seeking sanctuary here. If you actually look at people's circumstances, the people in Calais have had very similar experiences horrendous experiences to the people in Ukraine. It's Afghans, it's Syrians. My organisation works.
Yeah, I get that. But what the government would say is that it's trying to discourage people from doing something which is illegal and dangerous. And that is the material difference between the crossings and Ukraine.
But the difference is the government isn't providing a safe route for those people from Syria or from other conflicts, whether it's in Somalia or elsewhere. So it's one thing to say you want to discourage people making dangerous crossings, but if you're not giving people any alternative, what you're actually doing is further penalising people that are already in a highly vulnerable situation.